Alright, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be doing a series review of Anthony Powell's A Dance to the Music of Time. So over the last 12 months, I've been hosting a read-along of Anthony Powell's book series, A Dance to the Music of Time. This is a series that I first read at the age of kind of 17, 18 and really loved, and then I didn't read it, didn't look at it, didn't remember it that well for several years, and then finally last year decided I wanted to reread it because I still considered it one of my favourite literary works of all time. It's been really interesting to read over the last 12 months, and I thought I would like to make a review, a kind of updated review of the series now that I've read it again in full. This is going to be a spoiler-free review. I have done spoilery review videos of every single book in the series as I've been doing the read-alongs, so I will link all of them down below if you have read the series. And at some point I may make a spoilery discussion on the whole series, possibly discussing the series with Nick, who I think's got a couple of books left to go. But once he's finished it as well, we might make a discussion video talking about it together. But I think for now I just wanted to do a spoiler-free discussion / review video talking about the series and my experience rereading it and what I found about it this time. So, what is A Dance to the Music of Time about? It's kind of hard to explain because it's a slightly weird series and the kind of thing that it's hard to explain quite how it works, but it really does. It's a 12-book series written between the 1950s and the 1970s, set between the early 1920s and the very early 1970s. So the series spans 50 years and it follows the life of a man called Nicholas Jenkins, or more accurately, it follows life and various characters through the eyes of Nicholas Jenkins. We don't actually often find out that much about Nick's life, especially in the later books. For example, Nick has children. In the later books, we never learn those children's names. I don't even think we know how many children he has. But really, what the series does is give you this kind of amazing character study and analysis of all of the different people that Nick meets in his life, specifically focusing on one man, Wimmerpool, who he kind of goes to school with and meets on and off throughout his life, who is not very likeable, very complicated, a bit obsessed with power, and just really interesting. But there's also so many other characters along the way. Somewhere at my parents' house I have like a guide to the Dance to the Music of Time. It's a book called Invitation to the Dance by Hilary Sperling and is a kind of directory of the series, including an incredibly long list of all of the characters who appear. There are a lot of them. It's a complicated and weird book that is character driven above all else, although there are plot and a lot happens and it's quite dramatic, and it follows really interestingly a 50-year section of British history which covers the Second World War and looks really interestingly at war. More than anything, it's just a book about people and about all of these people that Nick meets over the course of his life. So, as I said, this was my second reading of the series. I read the series first when I was 17 or 18, that kind of age. I think I was in my last 2 years at secondary school. And I fell in love with the series. And I think what I fell in love with in many ways was the fact that it was so different to anything else that I had read, because it spans such a long period of time. And it's so rewarding because you meet a character in book 1 and then you don't meet them again until book 7 or something like that. And the way it kind of weaves characters in and out is just really brilliant. A bit Dickensian. Also the humour and the way the book looks at kind of history and how Britain changed over this 50-year period is wonderful, and the characterisation is so strong and the premise and the kind of setup of it so unusual that I just loved it so much when I was 17 or 18. On my rereading, I still love it a lot. I don't think I necessarily love it quite as much as I did the first time I read it. Partly I think because the premise is so interesting and the character's so strong that rediscovering it, while amazing, was not quite as fantastic. And also because I think actually, the time of my first reading and now, I like the first half of the series better. Or perhaps I like the first 3/4 of the series better. The last 3 books for me are not as strong, and it was interesting to realise as rereading them that I had forgotten the last 3 books quite a lot. And though I really like them, I don't love them quite as much. And I think that's partly just to do with like my historical interest. I'm much more interested in the history of the first half of the 20th century than I am in the 50s and 60s. So that might be partly why the last few books in the series weren't as strong for me. And also because the Second World War happens in the middle and that changes quite a lot of the dynamics, and therefore I missed quite a lot of the dynamics from the first 6 books in the last 3 books. I also think in some ways, just because the premise is so strong and so different, I had remembered it in a particular way, were actually reading the books. I mean, I still love them, like I still would give them 5 stars. I think I would still say that A Dance to the Music of Time is my favourite series of all time. But for example, when I reached 5,000 subscribers like a year ago, I did a favourites week and I made lots of videos of like my favourite books of all time, and one video I did was my top 5 favourite classics, and I put A Dance to the Music of Time at number 5. And if I were to remake that video today, like I wouldn't put it there. I love Pride and Prejudice much more than A Dance to the Music of Time. I don't know why I thought that wasn't the case. Actually, while I think it's such a fantastic series and so interesting and so different, and like I said, still one of my favourite series of all time, I don't think it would rank quite so highly in my like favourite works of literature or favourite classics of all time as I thought it would a year ago before having reread it, if that makes sense. So I did really enjoy rereading it, but there are definitely books in here that I love more than others, and definitely like my favourite books are much earlier on in the series and the last few books were not as strong for me. So for example, like A Buyer's Market and The Acceptance World, Casanova's Chinese Restaurant, and Lady Molly's, like I love those books so much. The Soldier's Art is fantastic too. But then like A Valley of Bones, The Military Philosophers, Temporary Kings, Hearing Secret Harmonies, I don't love them quite as much. I think because in my head I had remembered it as one series and a block, I therefore hadn't really thought about the fact that there are some books I remembered much better because I had loved them much more. Whereas now rereading it, I think I'm aware that there are some books that have a really strong place in my heart and are like absolute 5-star reads for me, and some books that are not really as strong. Like I still love the series as a whole a lot, and I'm really glad I reread it, but I don't think it holds quite the same place in my heart that it did when I read it 7 years ago for the first time. And I think it's partly to do with the characters that the books focus on. A lot of my favourite characters are characters who are more important in the earlier books, whereas some of my less favourite characters, like Pamela, are much more important in the later books. However, leaving aside that, I also want to talk about what I do love about this series. One thing is just the characterization is amazing. Like the analysis and the character development and the character changes over the course of the book is just so wonderful. I think my favourite characters would have to be Stringham and Morland, probably. Also maybe Uncle Giles and Mr. Deacon. Also Nick, the main character, although he doesn't always analyse himself. Also Isabel. She's a great character. Another one who isn't massively analysed, but another one that is very interesting when you do get little insights into her personality. I also think Wimpole is an outstanding creation. I'm not sure I like him in the sense that I don't feel like the same fondness towards Wimpole that I really feel for Stringham and Morland, but he's such a well-drawn character, and the character development and the changes this man goes through over the course of his life that is tracked in this book is just amazing. Like it's just so interesting and so fascinating and so well done. But even like these ones I'm mentioning, they're all the main characters. If I think about all the minor characters or the less important characters I love in this series, you know, Norman Chandler and Mrs. Fox and Chips Lovell and Dickie Umfreville and Mrs. McClintock and Mattie and Mrs. Erdley and Odo Stevens, like there's so many interesting, powerful, well-drawn characters in here, and it's an absolute master of a character study and a master of creation. It's really wonderful. The characterization, like if you're interested in how characterization works, or you're someone who writes and wants to know about characterization, like you have to read A Dance to the Music of Time because it is the like ultimate character study. But aside from the characterization, it's also a series that is very like thematically driven, and there's a lot of very interesting themes running throughout the series. Themes of art and literature, themes of war and grief and kind of changes over time, themes of family and friendship and love and kind of human connection. A lot of the series is about how people grow and change over time and how that affects the relationships between these people, and that is something I find really interesting. But it's also a series about history, following life in Britain from 1921 to 1971, this period of time in which a huge amount changed, and kind of examining that and how that affects people in such an interesting way. Another thing I really like about this series is the perspective in it. The books are told, as I've already said, from the perspective of a character called Nicholas Jenkins, but they're not really about Nick. They're in many ways much more about the character of Wimpole and also about all the other people around them. I think it's very interesting to look at A Dance to the Music of Time as this kind of like over-the-shoulder narrative, a book that is told from the perspective of one person but is really about another person entirely, and kind of how that works and the structure of that is really fun. One thing that sometimes frustrates me in first-person novels is how Sometimes first-person narrators can seem very like egotistical and self-obsessed. I've read lots of first-person narratives where the main character has got really on my nerves by the end of the book because I felt that they were very like self-obsessed. I'm thinking, for example, of a book like Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch, whereas what I love about A Dance with the Music of Time is that it's not about the person whose perspective you see it from on one level, although of course although Nick doesn't analyse himself in the same way he analyses other people, you learn about Nick through the way that he analyses and sometimes misjudges other people. And that's wonderful, but that's so subtle and clever, and I really, really love that. And it's so interesting to have a book that is not focused on the narrator, where the narrator is not really the main character. And another reason why I quite like it is because there is a lot to be said for the theory that A Dance with the Music of Time is loosely based on the life of Anthony Powell, although a lot of the characters, including the narrator, were taken from his own life. I have a biography of Anthony Powell sitting on my bookshelf, which I'm definitely going to be picking up at some point in the next year or two now that I've finished rereading A Dance with the Music of Time, and I think that'll be really interesting in terms of looking at what in his life actually did inspire this series. But I think one of the reasons why like Nick and a few particular people around him aren't analysed, or why, for example, like Nick's children are never featured, I think it's partly because that's like, you know, they're based on like Anthony Powell's own family and he didn't like want to examine them in that way, which I think is quite nice in some ways and just a bit different. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I have to say about this series. It's been a really interesting rereading experience, partly, as I said, because some books were just as incredible and wonderful as I remembered, and partly because some books I had forgotten that I wasn't as enamoured with them as I was with the rest of the series. It's been a really, really interesting reading project over the last year, and it's been really fun to read them over the course of a year because there are 12 books, and it's been fun to hear other people's thoughts on the book series as well. So yeah, I think that's all. Please let me know down in the comments if you've been reading along with the series and what you thought of it, or if you haven't been joining in with the read along, if you're interested in reading this series at some point in the future, because I really would recommend it. It's a very interesting and different read. And that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.